12-year-old Emily Carter wasn't supposed to be in William Hayes's office. The billionaire sat slouched in his leather recliner, eyes half shut, as though he'd drifted off after a long meeting. Across the Persian rug, his personal safe stood mysteriously open, spilling cash onto the floor, as if it had been torn through in a hurry. Through the smallest slit of his gray eyes, William watched the girl approach, oversized blue rubber cleaning gloves dangling past her wrists. He waited for her to prove what 5 decades of betrayal had drilled into him, that everyone, even children, had a price. But what Emily did next would haunt William for weeks. It would chip away at the armor he had built, shake the cynicism that kept him alive, and remind him that in a mansion with 27 rooms, priceless art, and cameras hidden in every corner, the poorest hearts sometimes hold the greatest wealth. The grandfather clock in William Hayes's study chimed 3 o'clock, its deep notes rolling through the marble halls of his sprawling Midwestern estate. He sat behind a broad mahogany desk, fingers pressed together, his gaze fixed on the wall of monitors in front of him. At 55 years old, William had clawed his way to the top of American industry, building an empire worth billions. But trust? Trust was something he could never afford. "Sir, the new cleaner has arrived for her shift." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. William didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the screen as a woman appeared in the grand entryway. Rachel Carter, 38 years old, single mother. Flawless references, too flawless. His instincts told him no one's past was that spotless. In his experience, everyone cracked eventually. Rachel moved with quiet precision, her uniform pressed, her hair pulled neatly back, her posture betraying the weariness of someone who had already scrubbed 3 other houses that morning. Behind her trailed a girl, her daughter, Emily. 12 years old, according to the background check William had personally overseen. The girl clutched a faded pink backpack, her sneakers squeaking on the marble floor, as she whispered, wide-eyed, "Mom, this place is bigger than our whole school." "Hush now," Rachel murmured, tugging her daughter's hand. "Remember what I told you. Be quiet. Don't touch anything. Mr. Hayes is very particular about his things." William leaned back in his chair, the shadow of a grin flickering across his face. Particular was one way to put it. His staff had other words for him: cold, ruthless, paranoid. They weren't wrong. But they didn't understand. Paranoia was what had kept him standing when his own brother siphoned millions from the company. It was what saved him when his trusted CFO nearly drained offshore accounts dry. Trust was the weak man's gamble. Suspicion was survival. Sunlight slanted through floor-to-ceiling windows, laying long bars of gold across the rug as William watched Rachel move toward the West Wing, dusting shelves with mechanical efficiency. Emily, meanwhile, sat cross-legged in the hallway, pulling a folder from her backpack. A pencil tapped against paper as she muttered multiplication tables. 9 times 6 is 54. 9 times 7 is... William found himself oddly transfixed by the girl's concentration. She chewed her bottom lip, frowning at the page, and something about the small gesture tugged at him. A faint memory, someone long gone. He couldn't place who. Days blurred into weeks. Each afternoon, Rachel arrived at precisely 3:15, Emily in tow. While Rachel worked, Emily settled into a quiet corner with her homework. Sometimes, when William passed through the corridor, she'd glance up, flash him a shy smile, and whisper, "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes." He never replied. His mask of detachment never cracked. But he noticed things. Emily always left her shoes neatly by the door. She gathered every pencil shaving from the carpet. She broke her after-school snack in half and gave her mother the larger piece, without fail. "She's sharp," William muttered one evening to his head of security, Mark Daniels, a former Marine who had been with him nearly 2 decades. "The kid?" Mark asked. "She notices things." Mark shrugged. "Kids see everything, boss. They just don't always understand what they're seeing." But William wasn't so sure. There was a knowing in Emily's eyes, a weight that didn't belong to a child. She looked at the world like someone who had learned early that it wasn't always safe. Then came the idea. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Rachel started, the thought struck William mid-report. Not a test for Rachel. He had already vetted her past 6 ways from Sunday. But for Emily. Children didn't have the Polish adults wore. They couldn't mask their nature as well. If you wanted the truth, you tested a child. William prepared carefully. First, he had the cameras in his office repositioned, angled to capture every inch of the study. They were state-of-the-art, invisible to the eye, smaller than a thumbtack. Then he staged the scene. His safe, normally sealed with a 12-digit code and a biometric scan, stood just slightly ajar. Inside, neat stacks of $100 bills sat beside a handful of antique gold coins. On the floor, a few bills lay scattered as though dropped in haste. Finally, he loosened his tie, leaned back in his chair, and shut his eyes halfway, the picture of a man drifting into a mid-afternoon nap. The test was set. The bait was waiting. Would Emily Carter reveal her true nature, as every soul eventually did? Or would this child, with her worn sneakers and careful ways, prove him wrong in a way that would shake his empire more deeply than any corporate betrayal ever had? William Hayes sat in his mahogany chair, the one piece of furniture in his study that was as much a throne as it was a seat. Its leather was black, cracked from decades of use, but still supple enough to embrace the man who had spent his life commanding empires from behind this very desk. 55 years old and built like a man who carried the weight of the world on his back, Hayes leaned into the headrest, eyes drifting shut just enough to suggest fatigue. To anyone passing by, he appeared to be dozing. Nothing unusual for a man who worked 18-hour days and treated sleep as a negotiable luxury. But William Hayes was not sleeping. Through the narrow slits of his eyelids, he saw everything. The glow of his wall of monitors flickered, each screen capturing a different angle of his mansion. 27 rooms, each under watch, each a piece of the kingdom he had forged and fortified against the betrayals that had marked his life. He could see the gleam of the Persian rug beneath his desk lamp, the open safe door angled just enough to reveal neat stacks of $100 bills and antique gold coins. A handful of bills had been scattered across the rug, deliberately careless, as if plucked in haste and abandoned. It was bait, a trap, and the stage was set. His pulse beat steady, controlled, the way it had during high-stakes negotiations, where millions balanced on the sharp edge of a contract. But beneath that calm exterior lay something sharper: anticipation. Suspicion was second nature to Hayes. He had made billions by anticipating failure, by knowing precisely when greed or weakness would tilt the scales in his favor. His father had called it paranoia. Hayes called it survival. The mansion clock tolled 3 o'clock in the afternoon, its deep chime carrying down the marble hallways. Hayes knew what came next. Like clockwork, Rachel Carter and her daughter Emily would arrive for the day's cleaning shift. Rachel, 38, single mother, college degree unfinished, references spotless, too spotless. Hayes had checked them twice, had Marcus Daniels, his head of security, checked them 3 more times. Nothing in her record raised alarms. But William Hayes had learned the hard way that human beings were not what their resumes claimed. Everyone had a price. And if you set the stage properly, that price revealed itself. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the long entrance corridor. Hayes did not stir. Rachel's voice carried first, calm, but edged with the fatigue of someone holding her world together with sheer determination. "Remember what I told you, Emily. Quiet. Don't touch anything. This is Mr. Hayes's home, and he doesn't like people disturbing his things." "Yes, ma'am," came the girl's reply, softer, but tinged with the high, curious lilt of youth. Emily Carter was 12 years old, her background file noted, though Hayes trusted files as little as he trusted handshakes. A child was harder to predict than any corporate rival. Adults wore masks. Children revealed. That was why today's test wasn't for Rachel. It was for Emily. The girl's shadow fell across the crack of his office door, left purposely ajar. "Mom," Emily's voice carried, a whisper, but one that slipped easily into the quiet study. "Mr. Hayes's door is open." "Don't go in there, baby. That's his private office." Rachel's reply came quick, almost fearful. "But what if something's wrong? What if he needs help?" "Emily, no." Rachel's footsteps retreated, the muffled clink of cleaning supplies signaling she'd turned her focus to the West Hall. But William knew the irresistible pull of curiosity. He had built an empire counting on it. Investors eager to peek at numbers they shouldn't, rivals desperate to peek behind curtains meant to stay closed. Curiosity was stronger than caution, especially in children. The faint sound of sneakers squeaked against polished marble. Then, softer still, the tread of small feet entering the study. Hayes's pulse jumped, though his breathing remained slow and steady. Emily Carter stepped into the room like a deer stepping into a meadow it did not trust. Her hair, pulled back in 2 braids, was damp from the drizzle outside. Her oversized yellow gloves, too big by 2 sizes at least, hung loose on her hands, fingers flopping comically as she flexed them. Likely borrowed from her mother's cleaning kit, they made her look less like a maid's daughter and more like a child playing dress-up. Yet there was nothing playful about the way she paused, taking in the scene. First, her gaze lingered on him, the mighty William Hayes, billionaire of Midwestern finance, pretending to slumber in his leather chair, her head tilted, her brows furrowed. For a moment, Hayes almost believed she might step back out the door, convinced the man was merely sleeping. But then her eyes moved to the safe. The money lay there like a serpent coiled in plain sight. Alluring, dangerous. Hayes's chest tightened. This was the moment of truth. The test. Would she pocket a bill? Slip a coin into her backpack? Children were impulsive. They reached, they grabbed. He had seen interns risk careers for a $20 gift card. Surely a girl from the rough side of town, whose mother juggled 3 jobs, would not resist the allure of bills crisp enough to pay rent for a month. She moved closer, each step deliberate. Kneeling beside the open safe, Emily pressed the cuffs of her gloves against her knees. Her eyes lingered on the bills, and Hayes caught a flicker. Was it longing, calculation, greed? His years of experience in reading expressions faltered against the unguarded openness of a child. Then, to his astonishment, she reached not for the stacks inside the safe, but for the bills scattered across the rug. One by one, with the care of someone tending fragile glass, Emily gathered them. She smoothed each wrinkled corner with her gloved palms, then set them neatly back on the pile. Her small hands struggled to align the edges, but she tried. Good Lord, she tried. Hayes felt his practiced breathing nearly betray him. When she pushed at the heavy safe door, her arms strained, shoulders trembling with the effort. After several seconds, the steel creaked an inch closer to shut. She stepped back, satisfied with the result, and brushed her knees clean. Hayes could hardly believe what he had witnessed, but she wasn't finished. Crossing to his desk, she noticed the glass paperweight near the edge, dangerously close to falling. She cupped it carefully in her gloves and placed it back in the center, safe from harm. Then, as if pulled by some invisible string, she approached him. His tie, loosened for effect, hung crooked. With infinite gentleness, Emily straightened it. Her touch so light, it barely stirred the fabric. "Sleep good, Mr. Hayes," she whispered. "Mom says everybody needs rest, even rich people." Then she was gone, her footsteps pattering down the hall, swallowed by the quiet hum of the mansion. William Hayes did not move for nearly a minute. His mind reeled. In 30 years of testing people, they almost always failed. Greed was as constant as gravity. He had built his fortune by exploiting it, by knowing it would always win. Yet this child, this 12-year-old girl with her oversized gloves and worn sneakers, had done the opposite. She had chosen honesty. She had chosen care. For no reason other than it was right. Finally, Hayes opened his eyes fully. He sat forward, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as they tapped the desk. His gaze darted to the monitor, replaying the scene. He rewound it, then again, scrutinizing every second, searching for deception. Sleight of hand, a hidden pocket, some trick. There was none. Just a little girl doing the right thing when no one was watching. He reached for the decanter on the sideboard, poured himself 2 fingers of Macallan 25, and walked to the window. Outside, the manicured lawn stretched 3 acres to the gates, autumn leaves swirling in the breeze. The sunset painted the sky with streaks of orange and crimson, as if mocking his turmoil. In the hollow of his chest, a feeling stirred. Not admiration, not gratitude, something colder, sharper, shame. Emily Carter had never been inside a room like this before. The study smelled faintly of leather and oak polish, the kind her mother sometimes used on the banisters of old townhouses. But here,
The scent carried with it a weight, like history pressed into the wood. She had walked in slowly, cautious of every step, on the thick rug, her sneakers squeaking just once on the polished marble before being swallowed by the soft pile beneath her. Her yellow cleaning gloves hung off her hands awkwardly, the fingertips folding down like the ears of an old hound. She flexed her fingers, embarrassed by how clumsy they looked. Mom had handed them to her in the car that morning, saying, "If you're going to tag along, at least keep your hands clean." Emily had obeyed without argument. She always did.
Now, in this vast study, those gloves made her feel like an intruder. She looked at Mr. Hayes, the man her mother warned her never to disturb, 55 years old, sharp as steel, her mom had whispered. The kind of man who can crush you with a look if you cross him. Emily studied his face. His gray eyes seemed closed, his chest rising and falling slowly like someone in deep rest. She tilted her head. Was he really asleep? Something about him seemed too still. She thought of Grandma Rose, who always told her, "Even giants need rest, baby girl. Don't let their frowns fool you." Still, Emily hesitated, and then her gaze drifted to the open safe. The sight almost knocked the air from her lungs. Bundles of crisp $100 bills, lined like little bricks of green, their edges so sharp they looked unreal. Gold coins glinted in the half-light, their faces stamped with dates she didn't recognize. A few bills had fallen across the rug, carelessly abandoned. Her chest thudded. One bill alone, just one, could pay the rent her mother worried about every month. 5 could cover the car repair that had kept them taking the bus for weeks. A stack could pay for Grandma Rose's medicine that was running out faster than insurance would cover. The thought burned hot in her mind. It would be so easy. Mr. Hayes was asleep. Mom was down the hall. No one would know. But then, like a voice at her shoulder, she heard her mother's warning from that very morning. "This man will never trust us. So you be extra careful, extra honest. One mistake and we're out." Emily's stomach knotted. She bent down, her gloves brushing the fallen bills. For a moment, her hand trembled, frozen between temptation and duty. The bills felt stiff beneath the rubber, their edges catching like tiny knives. Her breath came fast. She thought about what her classmates would say if they saw her now. Some of them stole gum from gas stations without blinking. A few bragged about slipping change from their parents' purses. Wouldn't they laugh if they saw her hesitating? But then she remembered Grandma Rose again, frail but fierce, saying, "Truth is like a quilt, baby girl. Once you tear it, it never covers you the same again." That was enough. One by one, Emily smoothed the bills. She pressed them flat against her gloved palm, then stacked them carefully inside the safe. Her small fingers shook with effort, but she pressed them neat as she could, as though making them tidy erased the temptation they had held. Then came the heavy door. She braced her shoulder against it, legs bent the way her gym teacher always said when pushing something heavy. The steel groaned, barely moving, but inch by inch she managed to push it toward shut. Her muscles burned, her breath hitched, but she refused to stop. Finally, it slid almost closed, the latch just shy of sealing. She stepped back, wiped her forehead with her sleeve, and nodded in satisfaction. The relief washed over her. But then, as her eyes swept the desk, she noticed something else. A glass paperweight teetering close to the edge. It caught the light in a way that seemed almost alive, like a drop of water about to fall. Emily darted over, caught it between her gloves, and set it squarely in the middle of the desk. Safe. Solid. She turned to leave, her heart still pounding, when her eyes returned to Mr. Hayes. His tie lay twisted, a bit askew. Without thinking, she reached out. With infinite gentleness, she straightened it, smoothing the fabric across his chest. "Sleep good, Mr. Hayes," she whispered, so soft the words felt secret. "Mom says even rich people need rest." And with that, she slipped out the door, sneakers padding back into the hall. William Hayes waited until her footsteps faded. His chest was tight, his breathing uneven. For decades, he had built his fortune on the belief that greed was inevitable. It wasn't cynical, he always told himself. It was practical, predictable. In 30 years of tests, employees and partners had failed him more often than not. Even the ones who passed usually did so for appearances, not integrity. But what he had just seen? That child had not only resisted temptation, but had done the opposite. She had protected his money, straightened his desk, even adjusted his tie with care. She had acted not like a thief, but like family. He reached for the decanter, poured himself a measure of scotch, and turned to the monitors. He rewound the footage, watching her every motion. The way she smoothed the bills, not carelessly, but carefully. The way she braced her whole body against the safe door. The way her lips moved, as if whispering encouragement to herself. Nothing about it was rehearsed. Nothing about it was coached. It was, impossibly, genuine. Hayes sat back heavily. His chest ached with something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Shame that he had expected betrayal from a child. Shame that he had staged this whole spectacle, ready to catch her failing. Shame that for all his billions, the one thing he had never invested in was trust. Outside his window, the sun slid low, casting the estate in amber light. For the first time in years, William Hayes felt something shift in his fortress of suspicion. A crack, small but undeniable. And through that crack, something dangerous seeped in. The possibility that his assumptions about human nature might be wrong. He didn't like it, but he couldn't stop watching the screen. The following days passed slowly, the kind of slow that felt like time itself was deliberately dragging its heels. William Hayes sat behind his desk as usual, a figure of cold calculation. The quiet hum of his mansion, punctuated by the occasional echo of footsteps or the clink of a cleaning supply cart, never once broke his focus. He had a schedule to follow, a billion-dollar empire to manage and trust. Well, trust wasn't a luxury he could afford, not after all the betrayals. For 3 days, he reviewed the footage again and again. Every angle, every moment. There had to be something he missed. He'd watched Emily Carter, his unwitting test subject, with the intensity of a hawk tracking its prey. What kind of child doesn't steal from an open safe? What kind of child puts money back in its rightful place? But Emily's movements had been deliberate, too deliberate for an accident. She hadn't even hesitated. She had smoothed out the wrinkles in the bills, adjusted the safe door, picked up the paperweight with the kind of care one reserved for fragile things. She hadn't taken a single thing, not even a coin. She'd just cleaned up. William ran a hand over his jaw, his fingers brushing against the rough stubble he'd forgotten to shave that morning. For decades, he had trusted only himself, and perhaps Marcus. The world, to him, was full of people looking to take what wasn't theirs. His brother had stolen millions, his first business partner had embezzled, and his last CFO had drained accounts with the precision of a surgeon. That's how the world worked. People took, they betrayed. He knew that the moment you let your guard down, you lost. That's why he built his fortune on paranoia, on suspicion, on being the last man standing when the dust settled. Trust was for the weak, the naive, and those who were too stupid to see the game being played. But this girl, she had shaken everything he believed. Emily had done something none of his carefully vetted employees, no one in his inner circle, had done. She chose integrity when it would have been so easy to choose greed. He poured himself another drink, this time a small measure of Macallan 25, the amber liquid sliding across the glass with a quiet finality. It was supposed to calm him, to steady his thoughts. Instead, it made everything clearer. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to admit it. But he couldn't ignore the evidence. He had been wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to dismiss the idea. That's what he had done his whole life. Dismissed everything that wasn't in line with his carefully constructed narrative of the world. But this was different. Something about Emily's actions gnawed at him. Something deep, buried beneath layers of distrust and self-preservation, had stirred. The next day, he called Marcus. His security chief was a steady hand, a former Navy SEAL who had been with William for 15 years. Marcus had a way of getting to the truth, no matter how many layers of deception William had put up. "Marcus," William said when his head of security answered, his voice low and clipped. "I want a report. I need to know everything about Angela and her daughter." "Everything, sir?" Marcus's voice was even, professional. "Everything. No stone unturned. Their financials, their history. I want to know if there's anything I missed, anything at all." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I've already done a thorough background check on them, boss. Angela's clean, no criminal record, financials are tight, but no red flags. Emily's a straight A student, some extracurriculars, nothing out of the ordinary. They don't have any connections, no hidden agendas that I can find." William's jaw tightened. He didn't like it. He didn't like it one bit. "Run another check. Look deeper. Find me something that explains what happened, because right now I don't have an answer." After he hung up, William stared out the window, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grounds. His mansion was beautiful, a sprawling estate nestled just outside the city limits, far enough away from the prying eyes of the public, but close enough for convenience. Yet, for all its opulence, it felt like a gilded cage. He had everything: money, power, influence. He could buy anything. He could get anyone to do anything. But what did it matter if you couldn't trust anyone? What did it matter if you had no one to trust but yourself? The walls of his fortress were closing in. The cracks were widening, and he couldn't stop them. He poured himself another drink, though he wasn't sure why. Was it the scotch that brought comfort, or the silence that followed each sip? Either way, it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. William tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to that moment. Emily, kneeling by the safe, picking up the fallen bills, carefully placing them back inside. How could a child, with everything stacked against her, resist the temptation? How could she make a decision based solely on what was right, with no thought of reward, no thought of gain? His questions gnawed at him, relentless, as if they were claws scraping at the inside of his chest. And then came the call from Marcus. "Boss," Marcus said, his voice lower than usual. "I've got something." William sat up straighter in his chair, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "It's about the maid, Rachel. It's her medical records. I dug a little deeper, like you asked. She's got a lot of unpaid bills. She's been living paycheck to paycheck for years. But what really stood out was the medical debt, almost $200,000. Her mother's cancer treatment. That's why she's working 3 jobs, why she's so tight on money. She's been struggling for years." William leaned back in his chair, a sharp breath escaping him. It was the kind of thing he should have noticed earlier. "Anything else?" Marcus hesitated. "Her background check came back clean, but there's a lot of red tape here. I think she's been trying to keep a low profile. No one knows much about her before she moved here. Just seems like she's trying to keep her head above water. Keep looking. If there's anything hidden, I want to know. Everything." William ended the call, his mind racing. He had done everything right. He had prepared, he had watched, he had controlled every possible angle. But he had underestimated something. Something he couldn't quite name. And then the truth hit him like a thunderclap. It wasn't just Emily that had changed the game. It was Rachel too. She had never asked for help. Never once. She had fought through everything, and she still hadn't taken the easy way out. In fact, she'd done the opposite. She'd kept her daughter's integrity intact. She had lived by the same rules she had taught Emily to live by. What did that say about him? About his fortress of paranoia and suspicion? Was he so blinded by his own fear that he had failed to see the truth? The next morning, William had an epiphany. He sat at his desk, staring at the camera footage from the last few days. There, in the corner of the screen, was Emily, moving with the quiet grace of someone who understood the world wasn't about what you could take, but about what you could give. His fortress, his carefully built empire of mistrust, was cracked. And now, for the first time, he wondered if it had ever truly protected him at all. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to feel something he hadn't in years: doubt. William Hayes stood before the massive window in his study, staring out over the vast expanse of his estate. The grounds stretched far beyond the manicured lawns, an orderly world that mirrored his life. Neat, controlled, predictable. Everything had a place. Every person had a role, and every betrayal had been accounted for long before it could happen. Yet, in the aftermath of his encounter with Emily Carter, a strange crack had formed in his carefully constructed fortress of mistrust. For the first time in decades, William found himself questioning the one thing he had always trusted: the instinct to distrust. The decision to put Emily to the test had been clear at the time.
a final measure to confirm his suspicions and reassure him that he had not lost touch with the world. But now the cracks in his fortress were beginning to widen, and with every passing day he felt the weight of that truth pressing on his chest. He had watched her twice more, testing her like he would test a colleague or an employee, setting up traps, seeing if she would slip, seeing if she would take the bait. But each time Emily passed with flying colors. She had put the money back in the safe. She had returned the lost documents to his desk without even looking at them. She had left his office exactly as she had found it, without taking a single thing. She had not stolen so much as a crumb. It gnawed at him. Every time she chose integrity, he felt the sting of his own failures. And so he devised another test, one that would push the limits. This time, it would not be money or papers. This time, he would test Emily's character in a way that even he would struggle to pass. The following day, William set up the next stage of his plan. He waited for Emily to arrive, knowing full well that she would.
The schedule was etched in his mind now. Rachel and Emily would arrive at precisely 3:15 every afternoon, the girl carrying her faded backpack and keeping to herself. William had made his decision. This time, he would place something personal on his desk, something with emotional value, not financial. He selected a photograph of his late father, a man whose memory had haunted him since his youth, a man who had built the foundation of the empire William had inherited. The photo, framed in dark mahogany, showed the two of them standing side by side in front of the first office building William had ever purchased, smiling proudly. His father's face radiated strength, the same strength William had prided himself on possessing. But the photograph was more than just a memento. It was a reminder of the life William had built, of the years of sacrifices, of the trust he had placed in only a handful of people, and how each of them had betrayed him in one way or another. He placed the photograph on his desk, positioned so it would be impossible for Emily to miss. And then, with the camera angles aligned and his pulse steady, he sat back, waiting for her arrival. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, familiar and routine. Rachel's voice floated faintly from the other side of the door, soft and unobtrusive as always. And then, the faintest tap at the doorframe. Emily entered just as she had the day before, her gaze scanning the room before it fell on the desk. The photograph gleamed under the soft light from the overhead lamp. William watched, barely breathing. He had expected Emily to act out of curiosity, or perhaps greed. It had become a twisted game for him, watching her move through the room like a careful observer of the world around her. But what would she do when presented with something that wasn't money or possessions? What would she do when faced with a piece of his past, a part of him that he had locked away for years? Emily approached the desk with deliberate slowness. Her eyes flickered to the photograph, and for a moment she stood still, almost as though she were waiting for permission to touch it. William's chest tightened. This was the test. Would she respect the boundary, or would she take what wasn't hers? Instead of reaching for the photo, Emily looked up at the clock. She glanced at her mother, who had just begun dusting the shelves. The silence between them was thick, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Then, Emily took the photograph from the desk gingerly, as though it were the most fragile object in the world. She didn't look at it immediately. Instead, she turned to William. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I think you forgot to lock the door to your study today. It was open when we came in." For a moment, William was at a loss for words. He had set this test up with the intention of watching her fail. Yet here she was, holding the photograph with the same care she had shown the money in the safe. And then it dawned on him. She wasn't testing him. She was simply doing what she thought was right. She was returning it. Not because she feared punishment, but because she respected the boundary he had set, even if he had never asked for it. "I'm sorry," Emily continued, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't mean to touch anything without asking." She placed the photograph back on the desk, making sure it was aligned with the edge, the frame set just so. William could hardly breathe as she straightened it, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The weight of what had just occurred settled on his chest like a stone. She had passed the test, not with the response he had expected, but with something far more unsettling. She had shown him something he had long since forgotten: respect.
Not because she feared the consequences, but because she believed in doing what was right, even when no one was watching. As the days passed, William found himself revisiting his assumptions. The more he watched Emily, the more questions surfaced. Was she truly so different from the others? Or had he been blind to the depth of human integrity all along? He had tested her again and again, pushing her with each challenge, but each time she had responded with a level of honor that was beyond his comprehension. It was maddening. It was terrifying. He had designed each test with the belief that people were inherently selfish, that everyone would fail when temptation was placed before them. Yet Emily had defied him at every turn, and with each test she seemed to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. And so, he devised one final test, one that would truly determine once and for all whether Emily Carter was the rare exception or simply a child who had been lucky enough to pass each of his trials. The test would be simple, and it would be immediate. William left a document on his desk, a contract that was intentionally important, yet legally meaningless.
He knew that Emily would come across it, and that her curiosity would lead her to examine it. The question wasn't whether she would look at it. Of course, she would. The question was whether she would respect the document's contents, whether she would leave it untouched, or whether she would take it in her hands. And when she did, he would know for certain if he could trust her. The mansion was still, as it often was, but beneath that surface of order, something was beginning to shift. William Hayes had built his life on the idea that people were tools, some useful, some disposable. But the problem with tools was that they could break, and even the most loyal servants could become unpredictable. Over the years, he had surrounded himself with people who were skilled in their work, loyal on the surface, but he had always kept his distance. Trust, as he had learned the hard way, was a luxury he could not afford. And yet, as his fortress of suspicion and control began to crack, all because of a little girl with worn-out sneakers and an uncanny ability to choose honesty, William's unease grew. He had watched Emily with a kind of awe mixed with a creeping sense of dread. She had passed his tests, each more intricate than the last, without a hint of hesitation or deceit. The more he observed her, the more he found himself grappling with the uncomfortable truth. Perhaps it wasn't the world that was flawed. It was his way of seeing it. But this feeling of vulnerability was not one he could afford to acknowledge, not entirely. There was more at stake than just his personal world view. The empire he had built, the people who served him, everything was at risk if the wrong person were to see his weakness. The mansion, though grand, had always felt like a gilded cage to him. He rarely let anyone into the deeper corners of his life, especially those who worked under his roof. The staff, the gardeners, the cooks, the butlers, they were all mere pieces in a puzzle he controlled with an iron grip. They had their roles, their rules, and they respected the boundaries. Or so he had believed. But now, something had changed. His personal fortress was under threat from an unlikely place. Inside the walls, among the very people he trusted. It wasn't just Emily's innocence that unsettled him. It was the fact that the people who worked for him seemed to be more observant than he had ever given them credit for. It wasn't just Emily that had broken his assumptions. It was the way she had shown him a path to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The trust he had kept so carefully locked away now felt fragile. That evening, after Emily and her mother had left for the night, William sat alone in his study, the weight of his thoughts heavy. His mind wandered back to the staff, particularly Gregory Hartman, his ever-reliable butler. Gregory had been with him for 7 years, and until now, he had been the very picture of loyalty. He had served William in a way few others had, anticipating his needs before he could even voice them. A quiet man, Gregory had always seemed to know his place. But lately, William had begun to notice something unsettling about Gregory's behavior. It was subtle at first, a slight tightness around the butler's mouth when William spoke, a brief flash of tension in his posture whenever Angela and Emily were near. And then there was the way Gregory seemed to be spending more time than usual around the household's financial records, more than anyone would deem necessary. It wasn't that William had suspected Gregory of anything outright. He had no proof, no solid evidence. But he knew better than anyone that people were not always as they appeared. The unease he had been feeling, this sense of something amiss, was not just coming from Emily or Rachel. It was Gregory, too. William's suspicion was confirmed one evening, as he happened to pass by the kitchen. The staff was gathering for their usual evening meal, and through the small gap in the door, he could see Gregory standing slightly apart from the others, his eyes darting back and forth, as if he were waiting for something. His hands were tense at his sides, clenched tightly, though the rest of his body remained still. There was a nervous energy about him that William had never noticed before. It wasn't just Gregory's behavior that had William concerned. It was the way his house was changing. Angela had been working in the mansion for a few weeks now, and in that time, she had gradually assumed a more authoritative role, even over Gregory. She kept the house running smoothly, organized things with an ease that surprised even the most experienced staff. She had become indispensable, and for some reason, that seemed to unsettle Gregory. He had been a fixture in the house for so long that the appearance of a newcomer, rising to prominence, had shaken something inside him. William decided it was time to address the situation directly. The subtle tensions were too obvious to ignore any longer. The next morning, as the staff began their work for the day, William called Gregory into his office. There was a stiffness to his movements, a certain coldness that he had never shown to his longtime butler. Gregory entered the room with his usual grace, though William noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the door, checking for an escape route, however subtle. "Gregory," William began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been noticing some things around here lately. There's been a shift in the air, so to speak. You've been acting different." He paused, studying Gregory's reaction. The butler didn't flinch, but William could see the flicker of tension in his eyes. "I've always prided myself on loyalty, Gregory," William continued, his gaze never leaving the butler's face. "And I trust that loyalty runs both ways, but I'm getting the sense that something is off." Gregory's face remained impassive, but William could feel the walls closing in, the silent battle between them playing out behind his cold stare. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" William pressed, leaning forward slightly, his voice a low challenge. Gregory swallowed, then finally spoke. "Sir, I've always served you well. I've always respected your privacy, and I've been loyal, as you said." He hesitated, but there was a flicker of something else, something that suggested more than just a fleeting thought. William's heart raced. He had pushed too far, but Gregory was playing a dangerous game, one that threatened to expose more than just his insecurities. "If you have something to say it," William said, his tone edging toward the cold indifference that had kept him safe all these years. Gregory's jaw clenched. "There's been talk, sir, among the staff, about Mrs. Washington and her daughter. They're not what they seem. Some of the others, they say things. I just wanted to make sure you knew." William's stomach tightened. "What things?" Gregory's eyes shifted nervously. "They say she's using her daughter to manipulate you, to get what she wants. She's playing the long game, sir. And there are whispers about you, too, about how you're changing." His voice faltered, but the words were out, hanging in the air like a poisonous mist. William felt the blood drain from his face. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice flat, though his mind was racing. The paranoia, the distrust, it was all rising once again, like a flood that threatened to swallow him whole. Gregory stepped back slightly, as if realizing he had overstepped, but the damage had been done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and William knew he would never look at the staff in the same way again. As William sat in his office, alone with his thoughts, the pieces began to fall into place. Gregory's behavior, his subtle warnings, had been a test of his own. A test to see if William was still the man he once was. And Emily, with her quiet honesty, had only made him more vulnerable to the cracks in the foundation. But now something had shifted. The staff no longer seemed like mere employees. They were players in a much larger game, and if they could manipulate him, if they could play with his trust as easily as they had, then what was left of the empire he had built? Shadows moved in the corners of his mind, and he wondered how long it would take before those shadows grew enough to swallow him whole. The house was eerily silent that evening. a silence that stretched longer than it should have. William Hayes sat at his desk, fingers pressed together, staring at the papers in front of him without really seeing them. The last few days had been a whirlwind of tension, the subtle changes he'd noticed in the staff, the constant hum of doubt gnawing at him. He had suspected something for a while now, but hearing Gregory's words from earlier still echoed in his mind. She's using her daughter to manipulate you. The idea seemed preposterous, but it lingered, unsettling him. Could it be true? Could someone, especially someone like Rachel, be trying to deceive him, using her daughter to gain favor? The question twisted inside him. What did it say about him that he even had to ask such a thing? And what did it say about his fortress of paranoia, the walls he had built so high that even the slightest crack felt like a gaping hole in his security? He had always believed that people like Gregory, who served him with such unwavering loyalty, could be trusted. He had believed that his instincts, honed over decades of navigating the treacherous world of business, would always keep him one step ahead of any potential betrayal. But as he sat there, the house feeling too quiet, too empty, something was telling him that he was wrong. He had been wrong all along. The next morning, the air in the mansion was heavy with unspoken tension. As the staff moved about their duties, William could feel the weight of their eyes on him. He watched them closely, his gaze flicking from one person to the next. The housekeeper, the cook, the groundskeeper, all of them had their roles, all of them had their boundaries. But it was Gregory that William kept returning to, as if the butler were the very axis upon which the entire house revolved. The more William observed Gregory, the more he became convinced that something was wrong. The way Gregory moved, the way he interacted with the other staff, the way his eyes darted nervously when he thought no one was looking. It was all wrong. William had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, of understanding their motives before they even spoke. And now, for the first time in his life, he was failing to read the very man who had been by his side for so long. His instincts told him that Gregory had been hiding something, and William knew better than to let things fester. If Gregory was going to betray him, he would have to confront it head-on. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. The empire he had built had been founded on the idea that weakness, any form of it, was to be eradicated before it could spread. At precisely 2:30 p.m., William called Gregory into his office. His voice was cold, unyielding, as he instructed his butler to meet him there. When Gregory entered, his usual polished demeanor seemed to falter for a fraction of a second. His eyes, usually composed, flickered with something William couldn't quite identify: nervousness, guilt, or perhaps something darker, more sinister. "Gregory," William said, his tone crisp, "I've been noticing something lately. There's been an unsettling change in the house." He let the silence hang between them, watching Gregory carefully, waiting for the butler's reaction. Gregory stiffened, but his expression remained neutral, as it always had. "Unsettling, sir?" he asked, his voice smooth, though William could detect the slightest tremor beneath the surface. William leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, you've been acting differently. Your behavior has changed, and I need to know why. This house is built on trust, Gregory. I've trusted you, but lately, that trust has started to erode." Gregory shifted on his feet, his hands folding in front of him. "I assure you, sir, I've done nothing wrong. Perhaps the stress of the household is wearing on me. The demands of the job have increased, but nothing that should concern you." William's gaze hardened. "I don't believe that, Gregory. The way you've been watching Rachel, the way you've been treating Emily, something's not right. You've become more distant. You're hiding something from me, and I need you to be honest." The words hit Gregory harder than William had expected. For a long moment, Gregory stood motionless, his face a mask of carefully constructed calm. Then, without warning, he stepped forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I've been loyal to you, William, but I can't keep living this lie. The truth is, I've been watching you. I've been watching how the staff has changed since Rachel and her daughter arrived. They're not who they seem to be. I'm not the only one who's noticed it." William froze. "What are you talking about?" His pulse quickened, a sick feeling creeping up his spine. Gregory took a step back, glancing around the room before continuing. "I've seen how Rachel manipulates you. I've seen how she uses her daughter to gain favor. to make you think she's the perfect employee. But it's all a facade, William. She's playing you, and she's playing the others too. William felt a chill run through him. His mind raced. This was it. Gregory had turned on him. He had been right to be paranoid all along. But the more Gregory spoke, the more William felt a gnawing sense of unease. There was something about his words that didn't ring true, something off-kilter about the way he was framing the situation. It was as if he were projecting his own fears onto others, painting Rachel with the same broad brush of suspicion that had once served him so well. "No," William said, his voice firm. "You're wrong, Gregory. Rachel and Emily are trustworthy. I've watched them. They've passed every test I've given them. They've done nothing wrong." He stood up, the weight of his words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. "You've crossed a line, Gregory. You've betrayed my trust, and for that, you're no longer welcome here." Gregory's eyes flashed, a brief moment of anger breaking through his mask. "You'll regret this, William," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you know the truth, but you've been blind. You've trusted the wrong people, and now you'll pay the price." With that, Gregory turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, leaving William standing there, stunned and shaken. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the silence heavier. Had he made a mistake? He had never expected Gregory, of all people, to turn on him. The butler had been more than just an employee. He had been a confidant, a partner in his empire. And now, just like that, he was gone. William sat down at his desk, his mind reeling. For the first time in years, the walls of his fortress seemed to close in on him. Had Gregory been right? He thought back to everything he had seen, everything he had heard, the whispers among the staff, the subtle signs of discord that had been growing in the background. The cracks in his fortress were widening, and for the first time, he couldn't tell if they were his own doing or if something else, something more insidious, was at play. He looked out the window at the sprawling grounds, the perfectly manicured lawns, the pristine trees lining the driveway. But the world outside felt like a different place now, a place where everything he had built, everything he had worked for, could crumble in an instant. The quiet had returned to the mansion, but it was no longer the peaceful silence it once had been. It was a silence that carried with it the weight of betrayal, the sting of lost trust. And William, for the first time in his life, wondered if he would ever be able to rebuild what had been shattered. William Hayes stood in front of the grand fireplace in his study, staring at the flames that danced and flickered with a life of their own. The warmth from the fire, so comforting just hours ago, now felt like an illusion, a fleeting moment of warmth that had been overshadowed by an overwhelming chill that gripped his heart. The weight of the past few weeks had left him unsettled, his mind a constant swirl of confusion and doubt. It had started with small cracks in his fortress of paranoia, but now those cracks had spread wide, and there was no telling if they could ever be repaired. The betrayal by Gregory had been the final blow, the one that shattered the walls he had spent his entire life building. For years, he had relied on isolation to protect himself, believing that the only way to succeed, the only way to remain untouchable, was to trust no one. People, in his experience, were always out for themselves. And that had made him fiercely independent, fiercely self-reliant. But now, sitting in the darkened silence of his office, William was beginning to see the flaw in that logic. Gregory's treachery had exposed a vulnerability he hadn't known he had. And while the butler's betrayal stung, it was not the only wound William now carried. The real hurt was deeper, buried beneath years of cold, calculated decisions that had kept him distanced from the world. It wasn't just Gregory's betrayal that had cut him. It was the realization that he had never allowed himself to trust anyone, had never let anyone in, because he feared that they might one day do to him what Gregory had. It wasn't until he looked at the photographs on his desk that William allowed himself to truly reflect on the years he had spent in isolation. One photo in particular caught his eye. It was an image of his younger self, standing with his mother, smiling, but with the faintest hint of sadness in his eyes. It was a photo from his childhood, taken long before he had constructed the cold walls of business around his life. His mother had always told him that family came first, that the people you could trust were the ones who would always stand by you, no matter what. But somewhere along the way, William had lost that belief. His sharp mind had become his shield, and his empire had become the world he hid behind. And then there was Rachel and Emily. Rachel's steady presence in his life had been a surprise, but Emily's innocence had shaken him in ways he couldn't quite explain. The child, with her unyielding honesty and quiet integrity, had made him realize that there was more to life than business deals and power. She had challenged the core of his being, making him question everything he had thought was true. What was the point of building an empire if it left him so empty inside? What was the point of wealth, security, and power if he had no one to share it with? For the first time in his life, William felt a longing for something he had never thought he needed: belonging. And that yearning seemed to grow with every passing day. It was late one afternoon, after the dinner hour had passed, that William made a decision. He had been sitting in his study for hours, staring at the same stack of papers that had been on his desk all week. But today was different. The house felt different. He could no longer ignore the shift that had been happening, the growing sense of emptiness that followed him wherever he went. He stood up from his desk, straightened his tie, and walked out of his office. As he moved down the long hallway, he felt the weight of every step, each one taking him closer to a decision he had been avoiding for far too long. When he reached the kitchen, the warm light spilling from the windows felt like a beacon, a signal that something had changed in him, whether he was ready for it or not. There, in the midst of the bustling kitchen, stood Rachel, preparing the evening meal. Her movements were swift and practiced, but there was a softness to the way she worked, a quiet care in the way she arranged the plates and set the table. Naomi sat nearby, her worn-out sneakers tucked beneath her as she scribbled in her notebook. For the first time in what felt like forever, the room was alive with warmth, real warmth, the kind that William had long forgotten. Rachel looked up as he entered, her face breaking into a soft smile. Naomi looked up too, her dark eyes brightening with recognition. For a moment, William stood at the doorway, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to even begin. But before he could speak, Naomi stood up, her small form a sharp contrast to the towering figure of William. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice as clear and direct as ever. "We've been waiting for you. Grandma Rose says family always eats together, even if it's just the three of us." The simplicity of the statement hit William harder than he expected. Family. The word felt foreign on his ears, a word he had avoided for so long. And yet, as he stood there, looking at Naomi, the child who had been the catalyst for so much of his recent turmoil, he realized that she had been right all along. The empire he had built, the walls he had surrounded himself with, meant nothing without the people to share them with. Rachel stood up from the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I told Naomi that dinner is ready," she said, her voice calm, yet laced with a warmth that William could feel deep within him. "We thought it might be nice if you'd join us tonight." William hesitated for only a moment, the old habits of solitude trying to take hold. But then something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to step away from the cold embrace of his study, from the unrelenting grip of his own isolation. "I'd like that," he said, his voice steady, though there was an unfamiliar emotion stirring within him. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, and yet he didn't pull back. Instead, he followed Rachel and Naomi to the dining room, where the small table was set, with plates of food, the smell of homemade cooking filling the air. As they sat down together, Naomi spoke up, her voice light. "Mom says I'm getting better at writing," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I even wrote a story about Mr. Hayes, and how he's like a dragon guarding all his treasure, but then he lets people in and they find all the good stuff inside." William couldn't help but laugh. The innocence of her words was a balm to the harsh edges of his own cynicism. Rachel smiled softly, looking between him and Naomi. "She's right, you know. You've spent so much of your life building walls, but now you're starting to let people in." For a moment, William said nothing. He looked at Naomi, her face glowing with hope and curiosity. He looked at Rachel, the woman who had come into his life like a quiet storm, shaking his world in ways he never expected. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, something he had never allowed himself to feel. The walls were coming down, brick by brick.
And for once, William didn't feel afraid. The evening passed slowly, the warmth of the meal and the conversations surrounding it giving him a sense of belonging he hadn't known he was missing. As they finished their dinner, Naomi leaned back in her chair and let out a satisfied sigh. "See, Mr. Hayes," she said, "family is like a puzzle. It's made of all kinds of pieces, but once they all fit together, it makes something really nice." William smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You're right, Naomi. I think I've been trying to solve the wrong puzzle all along." And as he sat there, surrounded by the people he had once pushed away, William Hayes realized that it wasn't wealth or power that mattered. It wasn't the empire he had built or the walls he had erected. What mattered was the connections he had forged, the people who stood beside him, not because they had to, but because they chose to. For the first time in his life, William felt something he hadn't known he was missing: belonging. The morning after the dinner, in the warmth of the dining room, where the walls had come down just a little, William stood in front of his window, his gaze sweeping across the sprawling grounds of his estate. The mist from the early morning fog clung to the trees, their branches heavy with moisture, as though the world outside was holding its breath. And for the first time in years, William did the same.
He was aware of the weight of his life, the years spent in isolation, the fortress he had built around himself, brick by cold brick, and yet, for the first time, he felt a quiet stir inside. It was as if a small door had been opened, and though he couldn't fully see what lay beyond it, he knew it was something far more precious than any wealth he had ever accumulated. The days that followed were filled with small moments, gentle steps toward a new kind of existence. William had made peace with his decisions, or at least he was learning to. Each day, he felt a little less afraid. The anger that had once consumed him, the distrust that had governed every decision he made, was beginning to slip away like sand through his fingers. He had finally realized that the true measure of his life wasn't in his business dealings or his fortune. It was in the people who had stayed, who had chosen to trust him, and who had, in turn, shown him that trust was still possible. The truth of his transformation became clearer when he looked at Rachel. Her presence in his life had begun as a ripple in the still waters of his routine. A new maid, a new figure to test, and eventually a new voice that was slowly, imperceptibly, breaking down the walls he had so carefully constructed. Rachel had become more than just a person in his employ. She had become someone he could rely on, someone whose honesty, even in the face of his cynicism, had begun to heal parts of him he had long forgotten. He had tested her over and over again with little things, pushing boundaries to see if she would slip. But time and time again, Rachel had passed every test with grace and dignity. She had been the constant he didn't know he needed. And now, watching her in the kitchen, preparing another meal with the same quiet confidence she had shown for months, he realized just how deeply she had become a part of his world. "Everything looks good," William said as he stepped into the kitchen one afternoon, breaking the peaceful routine. Rachel looked up, her hands still busy with preparing vegetables for the evening's dinner. "It should. Naomi helped set the table today. She's excited about the school project she's working on," she said, her smile soft but warm. "She's been doing great in school, by the way. They're all so impressed with her, especially her writing. Her teacher told me she could go places if she keeps up with this focus." William nodded thoughtfully. He had heard Rachel's stories about Naomi's progress, and something inside him swelled with a pride he hadn't expected to feel. He hadn't thought much about the child's potential, but now, looking at the way she had impacted their lives, he saw it clearly. "I'm glad," he said quietly, watching Naomi pass by the doorway, her face alight with that familiar, innocent joy. "She's a good kid, a better kid than I ever was at her age." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "I find that hard to believe. You weren't always so hardened, William." He chuckled softly, the sound unfamiliar to his own ears. "Maybe not, but I lost something along the way. I built so many walls that I forgot how to let anyone inside." Rachel's gaze softened, and she set down the knife she had been using to chop the vegetables. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing beyond the man who had built an empire to the man he was becoming. "I think you're letting people in now," she said simply. "That's the hardest part, isn't it?" Later that week, William made another decision, One that, in hindsight, seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He had spent years carefully constructing his empire, protecting it from threats, real or imagined. But now, the very thing that had made his fortune, his unyielding trust in no one, was the same thing that was suffocating him. The irony of it hit him square in the chest. He had spent his life learning how to protect himself, only to realize that the one thing that could truly protect him was something he had never allowed himself to have. Trust. William didn't need to keep his wealth hidden anymore. He didn't need to shut himself off from the world. It wasn't the treasures locked in his vaults that mattered. It was the people who shared his life, even if they didn't have the same wealth, the same titles, or the same reputation. And so he called Marcus, his head of security. Marcus had been with him for years, a constant presence, but even he had seen the changes in William's demeanor over the past few months. The old William would have never considered what he was about to say, but today he felt differently. Today he understood the importance of true loyalty and the power of humility. "Marcus, I need you to start a process for making the foundation more transparent," William said, sitting behind his desk. His fingers drummed lightly on the surface. "I'm not talking about just business. I mean everything. I want to make sure that people understand where our wealth goes, who it benefits, and how we contribute to the world." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but William could see the understanding in his eyes. "Sir, you've never discussed anything like this before." "I know," William admitted, "but it's time I start." He wasn't entirely sure what had driven the change in him. Maybe it was the quiet resilience of Emily, the honest, unflinching way Rachel had supported him. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that he couldn't keep living the way he had. He had spent too much time avoiding connections, too many years clinging to what he believed was security. "Make the necessary arrangements," he said firmly, his voice steady. "And begin with the Washington family." In the weeks that followed, the transformation in William's life became even more apparent. Naomi received an invitation to Preston Academy, the prestigious school she had worked so hard to qualify for. Angela was offered a permanent, salaried position managing the household, with health benefits for her and her family. Both women, who had once been viewed as just employees, were now central figures in his life. His wealth, his empire, now had a purpose beyond the personal gain it had once represented. He could share it, build upon it, use it to empower others. Rachel had helped him see that what he had spent so long believing was important. Power, wealth, control was only a small part of the picture. The true value was in the people he surrounded himself with, in the family he was finally allowing himself to be a part of. But it wasn't just the Washingtons who benefited from the changes. The staff, too, found their roles transformed. Mrs. Patterson, once the quiet housekeeper, became an integral part of the operation, working with Angela to ensure the household ran smoothly. Marcus was no longer just security. He became a trusted advisor, helping William rebuild what had once been a fortress of distrust into something stronger, a foundation of trust. Months passed, and though the scars of betrayal never fully disappeared, William found that the feeling of belonging he had longed for was no longer a fleeting dream. It was real. It was here, in the warmth of this family, in the way they worked together, laughed together, and supported each other. His mansion, once empty and cold, was now filled with life, and for the first time in years, William was not alone. One afternoon, as William sat at the kitchen table with Rachel, Naomi, and Angela, he looked around at the faces that had become more than just those of employees. They were his family now, a family built not on blood, but on loyalty, love, and shared understanding. Naomi was sharing stories about her latest school project, and Rachel was offering quiet, knowing smiles as Angela spoke with pride about her daughter's progress. "Mr. Hayes, don't you think it's funny?" Naomi said suddenly, breaking through his thoughts. "How all this stuff you worked for, it wasn't really the important stuff after all." William smiled. A deep, genuine smile. "Yes, Naomi," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think you're absolutely right. If you found William's journey from isolation to belonging inspiring, imagine what changes could unfold in your own life if you embraced trust and connection over walls and distrust." What's one step you could take today to build a stronger connection with those around you? If you enjoyed this story and want to dive deeper into themes of personal growth, trust, and transformation, be sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know how you relate to William's story. Have you ever struggled with trusting others, or has someone's honesty ever changed your perspective? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge our ideas of success, happiness, and what it means to truly connect with others. By subscribing, you'll get access to content that inspires, motivates, and reminds us all that the most meaningful connections in life come from trust and understanding. Join our growing community, and let's continue to learn and grow together. Your journey starts here.